All right, so the rest of chapter 2 is really pretty straightforward. Just talks about the periodic table a little bit. So we know now some information about the periodic table. We know, when we're dealing with an element, we have its atomic number, and this is a typo. The helium's atomic mass on the periodic table is not 1. For some reason, they messed up here. They put the mass of hydrogen instead of helium. But helium is 4.00260. So on average, how many neutrons are in most helium atoms? 2 neutrons, 2 protons. That gives me a mass of 4. So any element on any periodic table, it should have the atomic number, so you know how many protons there are. It should have the average mass, so you know what the mass is for those atoms on average. They're also arranged in periods and groups. The period is a horizontal row. The period gives me information about how far away the outer electrons are from the nucleus. We'll talk more about that later. Don't worry about that for now. They're also organized into metals, nonmetals, and metalloids. So the metals are the ones here in gray. Most of the elements on the periodic table are metals. What metals have in common, why it's important to distinguish them, is that metals have outer electrons that are not held very tightly. Right? So in an atom, you've got the protons creating a positive charge in the nucleus. The electrons that are right next to that are usually really stable because they're close. They have a strong electrostatic potential attraction. Talked about that formula that attracts them in there. As I go farther out, the distance becomes greater. And if I've got a metal, usually what that means is I've got 1 or more electrons in a level that's kind of far out from the nucleus. They're not feeling much of an attraction. So they are susceptible to being lost from the atom and picked up by a different atom that can attract those negatively charged electrons better. So then the opposite are the nonmetals. They're the elements that attract their electrons much better. So when nonmetals have electrons, they might share their electrons with another atom, make a covalent bond, which we'll talk much more about later. But they're usually not going to have their electrons pulled away from them completely. And then the metalloids have some characteristics of both categories. And those characteristics or abilities to hold their electrons tightly versus where the metals have their electrons be pulled away has a big impact on the properties of metals versus nonmetals, which we'll talk more about later as well. The vertical columns are called groups. And so this is where it's nice because elements in the same group have similar properties. But what we notice is, except for this column here with the noble gases, but the other columns that have nonmetals, at the top, those are nonmetals. They hold their electrons tightly. But as we go down for each one of those rows, we get more and more metallic character, less and less non-metallic character. What that tells me is as I go down on the periodic table, even though they're in the same group and they have similar properties, as I go down, the properties are going to be changing. Because elements, as I go down this periodic table, I have to keep putting more and more and more electrons in. As I put more and more electrons in, the new electrons get further and further away from the nucleus, so they're less effectively attracted and they can get pulled out. And when an atom holds its electrons tightly versus one that has its electrons loosely held and they can get pulled out by other things, they're going to have very different properties chemically and physically, which we'll talk more about later. Then there are names for certain groups, which I don't expect you to memorize. The only one that you should know as we move forward are the halogens, and we'll do a lab based on the halogens, lab 3, so we'll remind you of that then. And you should know the noble gases, because the noble gases are all stable with the number of electrons that they have to balance out their charge.